I remember that one of the reasons that Jews succeeded in America was that they had the ability, based on long European experience, to find and then exploit niches in the economic structure of this new homeland. Sometimes there was an opportunity with no establishment, no people already there who could keep them out. Here are a couple of examples. Peddling. Peddling was a Jewish enterprise for a long time. Taking a pack of shirts on your back, or eventually maybe a cart with a mule, and going from farm to farm, from town to town, selling your merchandise. Now, when the peddler got to the end of his road, he had an empty cart, and he wanted to come back to the city with something to sell. So what did he do? He picked up scrap metal, loaded it in, and sold it when he got back. And the junk business, or as it's called now, the secondary metal business, was really a function of empty peddler carts. Department stores. Almost all the department stores in America had Jewish partners or owners at one time. And how about in medicine? Jews who wanted to become surgeons in the 1910s and 20s had a hard time breaking in. But they became psychiatrists, because psychiatrists didn't even exist until Sigmund Freud began to work between 1900 and 1910. And so there was no establishment, no one could stop them. Sometimes Jews found an opportunity in a business because there was anti-Semitism. Now, such an opportunity occurred in the 1900s, early 20s perhaps. Jews had been barred from resorts and vacation places, establishments in the Northeast. The sign, "No Jews Wanted," was prominent in many of these places. And yet, here they were living in crowded and unsanitary conditions in New York City, and they desperately wanted some kind of a place where they could vacation, get fresh air, have a little recreation, and be welcomed. They also wanted summer camp facilities for their children, since both recreation and health were lacking in the city. The fact is that by 1910 or 20, Jews were beginning to move out of the lower classes and have a little bit of disposable income. They were becoming, if nothing else, lower middle class, if not middle class altogether. So what did they do? They turned to an area called the Catskill Mountains, which is about 100 miles from New York City. And it filled all of these needs. It was underdeveloped, and therefore there were no barriers to Jewish vacationers and camps. This area came to be known as the Jewish Alps. It was also called the Borsch Belt, after a very rich beet soup into which you put a big spoonful of sour cream and enjoyed. It was a cold soup, sort of like the Jewish version of gazpacho or vichyssoise. Now, there were a number of very large hotels that were built in those days. Huge hotels that could accommodate 1,000 or more people. Brown's, the Concord, Grossinger's, Kutcher's, the Nevele. All of these were established to cater to this new trade of somewhat better placed Jews, the people who had a little money. Guests would arrive on one of the two very short railroads that served this area. Now, you've never heard of them because they really don't exist except in historical terms. But the New York, Ontario, and Western Railroad and the Ulster and Delaware Railroad ran up from New York City into this area, stopping every 10 or 15 miles to discharge passengers, pick up freight, and service the area. By the end of the 20s, of course, there were cars. The hotels provided all kinds of recreation: golf, tennis, shuffleboard, horseback riding. They had sports of every kind. They had dancing classes and sumptuous dining. Now, you've probably seen the movie Dirty Dancing, and this is the epitome of what was going on. That's a little bit later in terms of time, but that's the kind of thing that happened. Now, let's talk about dining for a minute. Jews traditionally had never been overindulgers of alcohol. A drunk Jew is a negative image and something that people look down on. But we had experienced many times of hunger. There were oppressions and people had to flee, and they often didn't have enough to eat. So they became like camels. They ate as much as they could at the oasis as soon as they got the food, so that if a bad period occurred, if a drought or a starvation occurred, they still had some residue of the old food. So they ate and they ate. And if you went to Grossinger's, for example, the waiter would come by and say, "What more can I get you? Would you like a second dinner? Would you like another portion of this?" And there was no limit to what you could eat. Now, unfortunately, all of these establishments are closed today, partly due to laws that prohibit discrimination in guest accommodations. Couldn't do it. But they had a wonderful time during their heyday. One aspect of the entertainment at these hotels was that they gave Jewish comics and others an opportunity to hone their skills before they made names for themselves on Broadway, in Hollywood, and on television. You can think of the lounges and the performance venues in these hotels as the equivalent of comedy clubs today, where people could go and do stand-up and practice and try out material on an audience to see if it worked. The list of people who started in the Catskills and then went on to make big names for themselves is very long, well over 100 names. Here are a few that you might recognize: Woody Allen, Milton Berle, Lenny Bruce, Sid Caesar, Rodney Dangerfield, Buddy Hackett, Jerry Lewis, Carl Reiner, Joan Rivers, Jack Benny, Mel Brooks, George Burns and Gracie Allen, Billy Crystal, Phyllis Diller, Danny Kaye, the Marx Brothers, the Three Stooges, and Don Rickles. And that's just a portion of the list. And you might ask, why did Jews often resort to comedy? They told jokes, and often the jokes were at their own expense. They laughed at themselves. And the reasons are very simple. They had lived a miserable life in Europe, and they had tough conditions in America. You could either laugh or you could cry. They chose to make fun of themselves and to laugh. Now, ethnic humor can also turn prejudice into something funny. I'll tell you a story about that in a minute. The human condition is, after all, genuinely funny. There's a long tradition in Judaism of poking fun at ourselves. It's called Galgen humor, the humor that you have as you're ascending the gallows to be hung. Besides, it was awfully dangerous to make fun of the Tsar or of the German police or even your neighbors who might rise up and attack you in a pogrom. So maybe you'd like to hear some of the stories. Some of the one-liners from the Borscht Belt, which can be terribly offensive in our modern sensibility, and they're really corny and even stupid sometimes, but maybe you'll get a laugh. Like the comedian, probably Rodney Dangerfield, who said that he was so unlucky that when he came home from the hospital, he was nursed by his father. How about physical complaints? Doctors are always good, right? So a man got up and looked in the mirror in the morning. He said, "I look awful." He called the doctor and he said, "Doctor, I look awful. What's wrong with me?" And the doctor responded, "I don't know, but your eyesight is perfect." Women sometimes came in for special treatment. I don't want to be a sexist here. I'm just reporting. So a man and his wife were sleeping at night and they heard a noise out in the driveway. They opened the blinds and they looked out and there was a man stealing their car. And the husband said to the wife, "Did you get a look at him? Can you identify him?" She said, "Oh no, I couldn't see him, but I did get the license plate number." One of my favorite jokes that they told is a subtle joke. It's about Yeshiva University, about the Orthodox schools. These guys study from morning till night. They usually are slender. They're pale because they're inside all the time. They often have bad eyesight because they read and they read and they read. So they're not exactly scheduled to be football players or baseball players or basketball players. And yet they decided they wanted to enter into big-time athletics. So they bought the finest shell that they could find for 8 persons and a coxswain. And they read every book they could read about rowing, competitive rowing. Finally, they thought they knew what they were doing. They went up to the Charles River in Boston, big regatta, MIT, Harvard, Pennsylvania, all the great teams. Washington was there. And they got skunked. They had hardly left the starting area when the rest of the teams were halfway through the race. They went back to New York and said, what did we do wrong? We thought we knew what we were doing. Let's send somebody up to Boston to watch how they practice, and we'll get it right the next time. So they sent the coxswain up there to spy on all these other teams. He came back. He said, "I know the secret." "Well, what's the secret? What's the secret?" "Well, in those teams, 8 people row and only 1 person does the yelling." It's a little subtle. How about this one about Jewish bravery? 2 Jewish men were on a safari in Africa. They're in a tent camp and they pull down the flap of the tent and they go to sleep. In the middle of the night they hear, "Roar!" Big roar. "Oh my gosh, what is it?" One man says to the other, "Do you think it's a leopard or a cheetah, a lion or a tiger?" And the other man says, "How should I know? What do you think I am, a furrier?" Parents also come in for some mention, shall we say. Sheldon told his parents that he had found just the right girl, the one he wanted to marry. But he decided that maybe he should ask his parents their opinion. He said, "What if I bring 3 girls home and we sit down and you meet them and you talk to them, and then after they've left, you tell me which one you think is the right woman?" So they did, and they served a coffee cake and they had tea or coffee. They had a very nice hour-and-a-half talk, and then the women left. And Sheldon said to his mother and father, which one should I marry? And the mother said, it's easy. There's no question about this. He said, how do you know? He said, well, the redhead in the middle is the one for you. It is? She is? Yes. Her we don't like. Now, here are a couple of more stories. A doctor said to his patient, I think you're going to live to be 60. The patient said to the doctor, but I'm already 60. And the doctor responded, see, I told you. Is that stupid? Yeah. People used to laugh at things like that. Or a patient goes to his doctor and says, I have tinnitus, ringing in my ear. The doctor says, don't answer. Jewish mothers always are good for a joke. So a man calls his mother in Florida and says, Mom, how are you? Oh, I'm not too good. I'm a little weak right now, she says. Well, why are you so weak? Because I haven't eaten in 38 days. You haven't eaten in 38 days? That's terrible. Why haven't you eaten? Because I didn't want my mouth to be full in case you called. A Jewish boy comes home from school and tells his father he got a part in the school play. Father says, well, what are you going to be? He says, I'm going to be the Jewish father. Father says, you go back and tell that director you want a speaking part. Sometimes the humor was a statement about how comfortable they felt in America. Now this last story might actually amuse people, but it's really a statement about Jewish belonging in America, that they felt comfortable enough to say things like this. Avram entered a church. He put on his skull cap, his yarmulke. He wrapped himself in his prayer shawl, and he began to pray. Very soon the pastor said, will all non-Christians please leave? Avram continued to pray out loud in Hebrew. The pastor asked again, and the same result. Avram stays. Finally, he says in a somewhat exasperated tone, will all Jews please leave? At this, Avram took off his ritual clothing, folded it up, walked up to the altar, and picked up the little statue of Jesus. Come on, my friend. Apparently they don't want us here. You have to feel that you can get away with saying something like that. That means you're comfortable with your neighbors. Now, don't think that it was only Jewish comics who entertained in the Borsch Belt hotels. Let me tell you that there were somewhere between 60 and 80 people who made their reputations up there first and then moved to Hollywood and Broadway for music and drama in great theaters. The list goes from Eddie Fisher to Al Jolson, Carole King, Barry Manilow, Neil Sedaka, Dinah Shore, and Barbra Streisand, just to mention a few of them. Hotels were not the only thing that they found in the Catskills. Cottage colonies were another way in which Jews took recreation. Visualize a central area with maybe a fire pit in it and a series of maybe 8 or 10 or 12 very small cottages around the periphery. Each of the cottages had a bathroom and a kitchen and perhaps 2 bedrooms, maybe a living area, front porch. These were favored by very Orthodox people who wanted to keep kosher, and so they had so they had to supervise their own food. But at the same time, they wanted to enjoy the ambience of the Catskills. And these were called koechelines, cook by yourself, cook alone. Very common, especially for Orthodox people. This was an inexpensive alternative to fancy and expensive hotels where the kosher quality of the food might not be quite up to the standards that these people expected. It was an ideal vacation for Orthodox Jews. The need for a separate Jewish vacation area has disappeared. Our society today is much more open, much more accepting, and the rules about discrimination are essentially gone. With that change, which occurred in the 1960s and 70s, the need for establishments like the hotels of the Catskills disappeared. But the legacy of cultural and entertainment richness persists.